I was taught that civilization was European. The timing fits perfectly with when Muslims dominated the construction industry. Church bells ring out and blend with the call to prayer. One of the minarets is called the Jesus minaret. Mary gets more mentions in the Quran than she does in the New Testament. We can recognize all of that in the Damascus Umayyad Mosque. This is the time when the Muslim civilization in Baghdad was 2 centuries ahead of anything that was going on in Europe. One by one, I go through the features of Romanesque. It's like a sort of huge piece of detective work. You mentioned Pisa and the Leaning Tower. Crusaders often came back bringing Saracen prisoners, just to give you a sense of how advanced the Muslim skills were. We have never seen anything with such astonishing geometric perfection.
Do you have any anxieties about returning to an HTS-led Syria?
None whatever.
When commentators talk about the relationship often fraught between Islam and the West, most start with the mass migration from the Indian subcontinent, North Africa, and the Middle East to Western countries in the last century. A few years back, the British Foreign Secretary announced the greatest culinary delight of the Brits was the chicken tikka masala. But many do not recognize the deep, often interconnected relationships between the European civilization and Islamic ones, and how much Islamic influence contributed to what we call Romanesque European architecture and broader culture today. My guest today, Dr. Diana Darke, is a historian and Middle East cultural expert who wants to set the record straight. Her notable works include Stealing from the Saracens, How Islamic Architecture Shaped Europe, Islamesque, The Forgotten Craftsman Who Built Europe's Medieval Monuments, and The Merchant of Syria, A History of Survival. In 2005, she purchased a 17th century courtyard house in the old city of Damascus, reflecting her deep connections to the region. Dr. Diana Darke, welcome to The Thinking Muslim.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's lovely to have you with us. Actually, let's start with that courtyard house in Damascus. So when was the last time you visited your house in Damascus?
In 2018.
Okay, during the Civil War.
So during the war, I actually managed to get back 7 times during the war.
Okay.
Despite being blacklisted for most of it, because I'm vocally anti-Assad, always have been, always will be.
Yeah.
I was never one of those who was in the sort of rehabilitate Assad camp.
Right.
So, yeah, but I bought the house in 2005. Yeah. Everybody advised me against it. Everybody said, you're mad, don't do it. And but I couldn't believe that I, as a foreigner, would be allowed to come along and buy a chunk of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, for goodness sake, you know. Yeah. So I thought, well, I'm just going to follow my nose and see where it all leads. And little did I know where, because actually pretty much all my subsequent work leads back to that house. So when people said to me when the war broke out, oh, you know, you must be so upset losing all that money in your house. People don't understand. It was never about the money. Right. It was purely about being able to restore one tiny element of Syria's cultural heritage. Yeah. Because the Assad regime never had the money to do any such thing. You know, they did a few flagship things, but houses like the one I bought were just neglected, semi-derelict, you know, and falling down. So I saw it as almost like a calling, a kind of vocation to, you know, to save one house. And that process, because I employed a Syrian architect. Together we built up a team of 15 Syrian craftsmen. Actually, some were Palestinian, because they were the best stonemasons, even today, as they were thousands of years ago. Wow. And so it was an incredible journey through the corrupt bureaucracy of Syria, the awful labyrinthine, you know. You couldn't make it up, frankly. The twisting and turning of what the regime expected you to do to get this license, that license. It was all a money-making operation. Yeah. But you know, with the help of my Syrian friends, by some miracle, we got through it all and succeeded. It was very unusual, very rare to be able to do that as a foreigner. And I think I think, I'm not certain about this, but I may still be the only foreigner to still own property in the old city of Damascus.
And are you planning to return back to your home sometime soon?
Well, obviously now with what's happened in Syria, because of my blacklisting, my most recent visa applications were just all turned down. Okay. And so I realized I just had to accept that. In fact, I even went so far as to get a German passport from my mother, who is German, thinking, well, if I apply on my German passport, maybe it'll throw them off the scent or something. But
yes.
But anyway, no. So most definitely now, with what's happened out of the blue, my goodness,
yes,
nobody foresaw that coming, and I will most definitely go back. In fact, my next book is going to be on Damascus anyway. Believe it or not, I actually was commissioned to do that and accepted it back in the summer. So even I will go back. Most definitely for the research and in order to see all my Syrian friends whom I'm still very much in touch with. Yeah. And I should say that they're people from all walks of life, different religions, different backgrounds. And that's what's so wonderful about Syria, that, I've got Muslim friends, Alawi friends, Druze friends, Ismaili friends, and Christian friends. And of course the Christian friends, people have to remember, are not just from one group of Christians. Syria's got 17, I think it is, different denominations of Christianity. Right. It's a very complex picture, but people historically have reveled in that diversity, and that is what I love about Syria.
I mean, within that pluralistic context, do you have any anxieties about returning to what is in effect an HTS-led Syria?
None whatever.
Really?
No, none whatever. From everything I've seen, I think this, all this sort of this worry about these Al-Qaeda links and everything are very much magnified by a Western perception of these things. But from what I've seen, and from what all my Syrian friends tell me as well, but also instinctively, the way I've watched Jawlani for a while, what he was doing in Idlib. And now, as Ahmed al-Shara, he's, I see the same things. He, in fact, more so. He, I think, is committed to a pluralistic Syria. He will take a pragmatic approach. He doesn't expect everybody to have exactly the same religious beliefs as him. He recognizes that Syria is a diverse place, and there needs to be a place for all of those different people with their different religions. And one of the beauties of Syria used to be that people didn't even think about, what sect are you? Where are you? People didn't even know. They're all mixed together in the same classroom at school. Yeah. So they were friends. Muslims and Christians were friends without ever sort of thinking, is that an Alawi? This kind of mentality is what Assad fostered during the war, to set communities against each other, that sort of divide and rule principle, which is very, very damaging. But I think Syrians have seen through it. They really have seen through it, and I think collectively they see what's happened now in recent weeks as a massive opportunity to get their country back. And it's going to take a while, of course. I'm not saying it's all going to be hunky-dory straight away. It will take a long time. There's been a huge amount of destruction. The infrastructure's just shot to pieces. So. It would be wonderful to think that people could just get their electricity back like that with some magic switch, but it's been destroyed, So it's going to take a long time. So in Damascus, they've only got 1 hour of electricity during the day and 1 hour at night. Yeah. But they're working on it, and there's a huge will to make it work, and it's just going to take time, that's all.
I mean, you're a cultural historian, and you specialize in architecture, and how much of that cultural heritage of Syria still remains post-Civil War? Well,
most of it, in all honesty. Okay. So in the case of Damascus, the old city of Damascus was not destroyed in any way at all. Yeah. The occasional mortar shell would land somewhere or other and cause a tiny bit of damage, which was minimal. Mm. But no, I mean, as so often, the media focuses on the worst parts. So, of course, Aleppo did suffer massive destruction, without a doubt, as did Homs, the old cities. But Hama, not very much. Palmyra, obviously spectacularly blown up by ISIS, so that is a big tragedy. But then Syria's got a huge amount else. There's Afamia, which is a sort of mini Palmyra, if you like. I mean, it's huge and massive, and so much of it is not even excavated yet. Even Palmyra is not fully excavated by a long shot. In fact, estimates, I think the last one I saw said that something like, only about 25% of it has actually been fully excavated. So that there's a lot more there. I mean, Syria is so rich. It's been such a crossroads of civilizations that pretty much every early civilization that you could think of is represented there. And again, that's one of the things I love about the place. It's so rich in its cultural legacy.
I want to explore the relationship between Islam and Europe, and through the prism of these remarkable cultural gifts we observe in European architecture that point to Islamic or Muslim architecture. But I suppose it's fair to say that there was cross-pollination between the civilizations. I mean, on the subject, or back on to the subject of Damascus, the great Umayyad Mosque, which has been on social media, and it's become quite a central I suppose, symbol of the completion of the civil war. You talk about a link between that Umayyad Mosque and Christendom. Can you expand on that?
Yes. Well, I mean, obviously, Damascus was the first capital of the first Islamic dynasty, the Umayyads.
Yeah.
So when the Umayyads conquered Damascus in 634, they obviously inherited what was there before. And so that was Christian buildings, Christian styles. And it's worth mentioning, actually, too, that for the first nearly 100 years, Christians and Muslims actually shared the site. The site itself, right in the heart of the old city, has always been the sort of spiritual center of Syria. So it began life as an Aramaean temple to a weather god, and then a Greek temple of Zeus, and then a Roman temple of Jupiter, and then it became the cathedral of John the Baptist, and John the Baptist's head is buried, supposedly. I think there are 2 or 3 other places that claim to have John the Baptist's head. Yes. But so that is in the site there, and for nearly the first 100 years, that same site was shared by Christians and Muslims, and they even entered through the same main entrance. Christians turned one way, Muslims turned the other. And it was only when the population outgrew that space and the Muslims needed more space that they, and this is recorded in the contemporary historical records, that they compensated the Christians and said, right, we need to take over this space now and build a new mosque for our growing community. And in compensation, we'll give you the sites for 4 churches where you can go and build new churches there. And so to this day, there are 17 different churches in Syria, different denominations, and the church bells ring out on a Sunday and blend with the call to prayer. It's one of those wonderful things I used to hear sitting in my courtyard house, every Sunday. And of course, when they did decide to build that mosque then, so it was built around about 705 to 715, to the very early 8th century. Of course, at that time, the top builders were Christians, because, they were used to the local building materials, the local limestone, and so Christian builders were brought, probably with some Muslims as well, to create this new mosque. And it's blended. When you look at it, you can just see that it's blended. It's combining all those elements that were there before. So it's got a Hellenistic gable taken from the Greeks. Okay. It's got a Byzantine dome. It follows the shape, it's kind of the space that was there before, the temple shape. And you can even see the blocks of the Aramaean temple at the base of it. You know, it's just astonishing. You can see all of that. You can feel it almost as you enter it. And then one of the minarets is called the Jesus minaret, because that's where, according to local tradition, Christ will descend on the final day of judgment. It's very typical of the sort of blending of Christian and Muslim traditions in Syria. You know, there's people forget that Mary gets more mentions in the Quran than she does in the New Testament. You know, Mary is a very important figure in the Quran, and so many of the biblical stories feature in the Quran as well. And so the mosaics, which are one of the famous things about the Umayyad Mosque, mosaic art was a top Byzantine speciality. So that's not a field that Muslims ever excelled in. The best were always the Byzantine Christians at that. So, but now, of course, they're working for new Muslim masters. So instead of doing their usual mosaics of saints and biblical stories, you know, they're doing instead an imagined Islamic paradise with trees and gardens and rivers and some fantasized buildings. So this is one of the interesting things that I focus on in my new book, Islamesque. You know, that, okay, we can recognize all of that in the Damascus Umayyad Mosque. We can see that the Christians made a big contribution to that mosque, except that they're now working for new Muslim masters. The same thing happened then, and this is what's so little recognized and what I try to draw attention to. So when the Umayyads were kicked out of Syria, and the one Umayyad prince who survived, Abdurrahman, makes his way across North Africa and sets up Umayyad Spain. So if you like, it's Syria in Spain is what they set up then in the 8th century. They take all of that with them into Spain, and they are so much more advanced than the European culture there. They're 2 centuries ahead in it. I mean, and again, you can see that in the buildings. Yes. So the Cordoba Mesquita, the main mosque of Cordoba. So Cordoba is the equivalent of Damascus, but in Spain. Yes. The Cordoba Mesquita is the equivalent of the Damascus Umayyad Mosque. It's modeled on it directly. That's the same measurements, the same everything. Now, it's been extended in subsequent centuries in a way that the Damascus Umayyad Mosque has not. And with each extension, all of the top innovations from the Muslim world, the understanding of geometry, of algebra, this, you know, we're talking the peak Islamic civilization in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. You know, this is the time when the Muslim civilization in Baghdad was, as I said, 2 centuries ahead of anything that was going on in Europe. And they brought all of that into the Cordoba Mesquita, into this very sophisticated civilization there in Spain. And the dome in front of the mihrab in the Cordoba Mesquita has got very early 10th century ribbed vaulting. This is how you hold up a dome made of stone, not of wood. So you need to be able to distribute the weight correctly. It's very, very advanced level of geometry you need for that, which did not exist in Europe at that time. Yeah. And then, you see, so the Muslims were in Spain for nearly 800 years. Yes. It's a very long time. Yeah. But during the gradual Christian reconquest of Spain, the Reconquista, as they call it, of course, new Christian masters are coming in, and the Islamic civilization is on the decline, and the Christian civilization is on the way up. But those Christian new rulers, the new bishops, the new abbots, you know, they want the best in their churches and monasteries, and so the best are the Muslims. Exactly the mirror situation of how it was back in Syria when the Muslims first took over. Yeah. They went to the Christians, who were the top elite people, but the role was reversed. And there's a reluctance to recognize that in Europe, that somehow when you examine these, when you look at the architectural history books, yes, they talk about, around the year 1100, this miracle happened, and there was this amazing burst of innovation in churches and cathedrals and monasteries. These wonderful styles came in, and they call it Romanesque.
Yes.
And that's what I'm saying here. Look, hang on a minute. Look at it, look at it closely, because actually the timing, the techniques themselves, even the decorative repertoire, everything is what was brought in from the Islamic world. And then, because they're now working for new Christian masters, it comes in to churches and cathedrals. And that's what I'm proving in the book Islamesque. So Islamesque is a word I've made up for the 21st century in direct challenge of this term Romanesque. And Romanesque is regarded as the first pan-European style, which leads on to Gothic, which then leads on to the Renaissance.
Right.
So they're saying, Romanesque is the essential springboard for the whole of what then happens in European civilization, the flourishing in the Renaissance. And I'm saying, look, that springboard was Islamesque. These are the things that enabled Europe to make these future leaps in the following centuries.
Yeah.
And that needs to be recognized. And what's more, you can train your eye to see it in the buildings. And that's my point, that the evidence is the buildings themselves. There's very little documentary proof. There are one or two people, who the history books record, but by and large, time and again, you get such and such a cathedral was built by Bishop so-and-so or Abbot so-and-so, and the craftsmen themselves who actually built it are anonymous.
Really?
That's it. No names at all. Completely anonymous until you get into the 13th and 14th centuries, and then you start getting a few names. And by that time, of course, these are all Christian names.
Okay. So I would like to come to, it's a fascinating, evocative picture that you paint here of 11th and 12th century and architecture and the debt it owes to European to Muslim civilization or Islamic civilization. The term Romanesque, what does that denote? Explain the Romanesque idea to me.
Well, the crazy thing is that the term Romanesque was only invented in the 19th century anyway by a pair of French art historians writing to each other, so in correspondence. So it's a made-up term, but it's kind of stuck, rather like Gothic. I mean, the term Gothic was only invented in the 16th century by an Italian art critic. And yet we now, in the West are besotted with these terms that we can't shed, and I think that needs shaking up. This this way of looking at it, that this is Romanesque and then that led to Gothic. These terms are nonsensical. They're completely nonsensical, because the way it's described, that then by some miracle Gothic architecture was born at this basilica in Paris, Saint-Denis, with Abbot Suger, his name was. And you read any art history book, and this is what it will tell you. The birth of Gothic took place there in that basilica. Yeah. And I'm saying, look, sorry, you don't just miraculously, like some sort of virgin birth, a building doesn't just pop out like that. There's a massive backstory that needs to be understood. Yes. And I'm highlighting that backstory and showing how it got to that point and where all those innovations came from.
Okay. So from the Leaning Tower of Pisa or the Salisbury Cathedral, if I was to, go to Salisbury Cathedral tomorrow, give me some specific examples of Islamic architectural techniques or aesthetics that I should be looking out for to prove your point.
Okay, well, if you want to look at somewhere like Salisbury Cathedral then, or Wells Cathedral is another good example. Okay. Well, there are so many, frankly, and this is the other thing. It was so difficult in the book to narrow it down. I was drowning in material. Really? It was just so much, Right. I just had to sort of whittle it down. But if you're looking at the things that, actually in the back of the book, I even have a gallery of images where of a whole range of cathedrals in this country and in France and in Spain and in Germany and in Italy. labelled up with all the different elements,
Oh, wow.
saying, you know, look, you know, this is on the facade. So there are so many actually, but you learn to recognise them. So in the case of Romanesque, it's the structurally it's the use of ribbed vaulting and the pointed arch. This is what starts to happen towards the end of what they call Romanesque. And this is very much the timing fits perfectly with when Muslims dominated the construction industry in Muslim Spain and in Sicily. Don't forget, the Fatimids were in Sicily for 300 years. And then the Normans conquered Sicily and took a lot of those styles then, and indeed the craftsmen, back into France and then into this country. And Norman, what gets called Norman architecture in this country is Romanesque. Norman and Romanesque are the same thing for an art historian. So they talk about Norman architecture, they mean Romanesque architecture. It is one and the same because it was the Normans who brought it here to Britain. So that's the way it's portrayed. But, you know, I mean, I'm saying, look, all of that needs to be challenged because you're not explaining where these things came from. And this is where actually we come back to my courtyard house, because the thing that provided me with my eureka moment for Islamesque is the zigzag, the pattern of the zigzag. And in my house in Damascus, there's a trio of zigzags, a pattern running all the way around the courtyard. And I could never understand what it was. And I asked my Syrian architect friends, you know, and they said, well, we don't know. We assume it's some sort of ancient archetypal pattern of some sort, some Mesopotamian thing or whatever. But nobody could ever answer me that question. But I was always sure there was something. You know, these things are never random. In architecture, whatever is chosen as a shape is deliberate. It's not just some, oh, I fancy doing a zigzag. It is much more to it than that. It's a deliberate choice. And then by chance, because actually my brother recommended it, I watched this documentary called The Secret History of Writing. And it starts off showing the presenter climbing up to a turquoise mine in the Sinai Peninsula. And on a hieroglyphic pillar, there is the hieroglyph for water is a zigzag.
Okay.
And that then comes into the early Canaanite, the very earliest phonetic alphabet, where they take the zigzag and it becomes the sound of m for water, like mai is Arabic for water, mai or may, you know, various dialect versions always beginning with the M. And if you think about it, even our letter M in English is a little zigzag too. And so as soon as I saw that, I realized, my goodness, that's it. My zigzag in my courtyard is water flowing around, it's abstract, representing water, but it's traceable all the way back to ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. And of course, I then telephoned my architect friend who's living in the house at the moment and said, show me a photo of how the zigzags emerge from either side of my iwan, the arch that faces the courtyard. And what that revealed was that the zigzags emerge from a circle like that. So like a spring, they're coming out, the water's coming out of a spring, running round the courtyard and then disappearing off into infinity. And he was so excited, my Syrian architect friend living in the house. He said, my God, I'm going to go and look now at all the other Ottoman houses in the city. And he said that it's the same in all of them. They've all got it, and it's clearly representing water. But here, in this country, you see the zigzag around Norman arches, and it gets called the Norman zigzag. But go to Sicily, and you'll see the zigzag everywhere in in monasteries, Benedictine monasteries, because they've taken it from it without really understanding that it means water. They've just, but also I suspect the craftsmen themselves were brought back, because you can't, you know, just because you've seen a beautiful building somewhere and you think, oh, I like the look of that, I want one of those. You can't just get your local builder to build me something like that. You know, you need the skills, you need the understanding. So they would have brought the top craftsmen with them, the Normans, once you know, they were wealthy by this point. So they wanted to build impressive prestige monuments, you know, and so they brought top craftsmen with them. And of course, those top craftsmen, as well as having the structural understanding of how to use pointed arches and ribbed vaultings to make buildings taller and stronger, they also brought in the decorative repertoire of things like the zigzag. So suddenly you get the zigzag appearing all over arches. I mean, you go to any Romanesque or Gothic church and you'll find zigzags around the arches. Anything that's called Norman will have zigzags there. But it's not been recognised as where it came from. So that was my clue. It starts with a zigzag. I even call the first chapter the zigzag clue. Yes. And then from that, I think, okay, what if zigzags are just the tip of the iceberg? What if this applies to everything that they're calling Romanesque? So one by one, I go through the features of Romanesque and I show where it's all come from. And it, without fail, it leads back often via North Africa, places like Kairouan, you know, very important, very advanced civilization, the Aghlabids, who were there before the Fatimids, you know. So this is very, very early. And the styles, which, you know, you get these decorative styles. I mean, I'd have to show you the images for you to fully understand it. But so in 10th century castles in ribats, as they're called, in North Africa, there's a pattern like that often occurs along the top of the wall. It's purely decorative. It's not serving any structural purpose. But that then appears in European cathedrals, and it gets called Venetian dental. You know, so I mean, and then Europeans just accept that. This is a European invention, and it's Venetian dental. End of story. You know, nobody questions where it all came from. So what I'm doing in this is like a sort of huge piece of detective work, going right back, forensically looking at every single aspect. And what's so great about that is you train your eye. I mean, I've got much better at it, believe me. Yeah. You know, the more cathedrals I've been to visit, the more I see it. You know, it's just your eye gets better and better at it. So you start to recognize every little aspect. You know, the use of what are called quatrefoil arches. So you mentioned Salisbury Cathedral, for instance. So the cloisters with in cathedrals like that, with very slender columns. Yeah. All of that is an Islamic aesthetic. The many slender columns that start to appear, the delicate tracery around within the arch, the particular shapes that are used, the use of lozenges. You mentioned Pisa and the Leaning Tower. Yes. So in Pisa, you've got these tall blind arches, and they're decorated with a lozenge inside each arch. That's exactly what the Fatimids were doing on mosques in Cairo. The Al-Hakim Mosque has got exactly that a century earlier, 2 centuries earlier even, you know, and the reason the Pisans suddenly get it, because there was no school of architecture in Pisa before this at all. There was nothing. But they conquered Palermo. And lo and behold, a decade after that, conquering Palermo in Sicily, they managed to build Pisa Cathedral, followed by the Leaning Tower, using these styles and designs and techniques which they have seen in Sicily. But in order to build those, they will have had to bring the craftsmen as well. Mm. And yet when you read about it in any Western source, it will it won't tell you that. It won't piece all these bits of the jigsaw together. It will just, you know, as I said, it makes it sound as if by some miracle, around about the year 1100, all this stuff suddenly, miraculously, was Europe emerging from its dark ages, and, you know, wasn't it a wonderful time? Without looking at it and saying, look, hang on a minute, why? Nothing just appears by magic like that. There's a reason.
And picking up on the craftsmen, you talk about two particular craftsmen, Palestinian craftsmen, who were quite important to this story, Lalis and Ulma. Tell me about these craftsmen and why they're important.
Yeah, well, it's very rare for the historical sources to mention the name of a craftsman around this time and to then give where he came from. It's very rare. So the two, Lalis and Ulma, that you've mentioned, are pretty much the only two I was able to find for this country, for Britain. And the reason it's documented is that so Lalis was brought back by a returning crusader who was a Welsh knight, a Glamorgan knight, and it's recorded that he came back with, and this happened quite a lot, actually. It is recorded that crusaders often came back bringing Saracen prisoners. And why would they do that? Because they had skills that that they knew were not to be found back in Britain. So they brought these highly skilled people back with them. And Lalis, what happened, incidentally, was that the relationship then between the craftsman, the top craftsman, and the knight becomes quite close, actually. I mean, they seem to get on very well, and Lalis is rewarded with being given an area of land and stuff. He seems to then have a family there, and there's a place called Laliston in Wales, which is named after him. And this is all recorded in the sort of gazetteers of Wales. He built Neath Abbey, which is one of the earliest uses of the pointed arch. Today, Neath Abbey is just a ruin, but it's still a very beautiful ruin, and you can see the techniques and the styles there. And when the Welshman died, what's recorded in the Welsh Chronicle is that Lalis then went to work for the king, for Henry I. And so, you know, again, that tells you this guy was the top, the absolute peak person. He had skills that nobody else in Britain had, you know. And so, of course, people learnt from him over time, but at the beginning, he was the top guy, you know. And this is, you know, what I do in the book is to trace. So when you have the arrival of somebody as major as that, the buildings that then start to appear under Henry I are the key buildings in this country, because that's where you can see, my goodness, you can see all these decorative things appearing which were never there before. And so you know that they've been brought in, you know, from, and then you find, by looking back, you can see the buildings where they came from, in North Africa, in Cairo, in Syria, all of those places, in Palestine, you know, you can see the antecedents of all these buildings.
So we have this collaboration between Muslim artisans and their Christian patrons. Did you find evidence of more than just sort of a transactional relationship? Did it foster, I mean, this was the time of the Crusades, did it foster some form of cultural understanding between the two civilizations?
Well, obviously at this remove, it's very difficult to know that for certain, but definitely from what we can glean from the historical sources, there are cases that are sort of harder to prove, if you like, that they're more kind of in the realm of folklore. But again, I look at them all because collectively they add up to something. They're not just, you know, folklore. There are enough of these stories about returning Saracens, as they were called. I mean, that was the language of the time. Arab Muslims were called Saracens by Christians at that time. So Saracens coming back, and groups of them. So there's one recorded case, for example, of a crusader coming back with a band of about 7 Syrian craftsmen, masons, especially masons. This was stonework was their real speciality, and this ability, as I mentioned before, to craft, pointed arches and how to hold up the structure. Then a stone ceiling, a stone vault, because obviously so much stronger and more durable than wood, which caught fire and was destroyed regularly. So that was the impetus to make it stone, which would be more permanent and durable as a building. And just to give you a sense of how advanced the Muslim skills were there, that dome I mentioned above the Cordova Mesquita, the very earliest ribbed vault, that 10th century we're talking there, that was examined by Spanish structural engineers, and they wrote a report on it, and they were just flabbergasted by what they found. They said, "We have never seen anything with such astonishing geometric perfection." And in its entire more than 1,000 years of existence, it has never needed a structural repair. This is the level of craftsmanship we're talking about there. So it is amazing. But to go back to your question about the integration of these people. Yeah. So this band of Saracens who were employed then to build local churches, there is evidence then that they start to get married. So they marry. Yes, they marry local women, and then families develop. There's usually a leader, the sort of key man, who's called a paynim, which is again the local word meaning pagan, sort of because he's not Christian, he must be pagan kind of approach. But even so, the relationship is clearly one of respect, because of the skills. You have to respect somebody who's got skills to that level, and so the names that these people took on, they started to take on some Christian names just to fit into the local community better, as you would, as happens even now. Yes. A new person from a different part of the world arrives with an unpronounceable name. You either give him a nickname or you call him Gary. Yeah, exactly. So, the same thing happened with Muslims. So, and there are records of that, by the way, in Sicily. You get records going back to the 12th century, where in land deeds and things like that, it talks about Roger, who was once Ahmed, and stuff like that, where they just changed their names, and Christians called Muhammad. It was very mixed up in a way that today we have trouble thinking that, oh, how could it have been that mixed up? But it was. It was so it was transactional up to a point, because what I establish is that when rulers change, that's going on at the top level, and of course the armies are fighting each other. But for everybody who's not in the army and who's not a ruler, life has to go on as before, and whatever it is, whatever skill it is that you've got, whether you're a baker or a metal worker or whatever, you need work to support your family. So you're going to carry on finding your work, to the best of your ability. And going back to Syria, that's exactly what I see now in Syria. So during the war, of course, there were businessmen who got rich under the regime. They found a particular area where they could make mega bucks. And so they did. They made mega bucks because that's what matters to them, make loads and loads of money. Forget the politics, forget the morality of anything, or just money, And now with the change at the top, these same guys, because they're very talented entrepreneurs, so they ditched the previous thing and they found the new opportunity. So they're now top-end hoteliers, because of course you've now got the world's media and all these delegations flooding into Damascus. So suddenly the place to make money is in the hotel business. This is what clever people do. They find the opportunity, because life has to go on. Just because the ruler has changed, it doesn't mean that everything changes. In fact, far from it. It tends to stay remarkably the same.
In your book, Stealing from the Saracens, you talk about a Eurocentric view of history, which has airbrushed a Muslim contribution to Europe's story. This may sound like an obvious question, but why? Why did this airbrushing take place, and why does it continue to persist to today?
Well, it goes back, I think, into the education system. And I mean, myself included, you know, I was brought up at school. I was taught that that civilization was European. Right. End of story. You know, Greece and Rome, that was it. You know, that was civilization. There was no acknowledgement of where the Greeks got anything from, where the Romans got anything from. And so I grew up with a very Eurocentric viewpoint of you know, Europe being the center of everything, really. And so it was only when I then switched to study Arabic at university and started to go to the Middle East myself that I realized, my goodness, this is where the Greeks got most of their stuff. You know, it goes further back than I've ever realized before. And then, of course, as I spent time in countries like Syria and Palestine and Egypt, you know, because I lived in these places for quite a long time, and I just began to notice how much has been, you know, taken, how all those similarities really, which I think it's important to acknowledge. As I said, I think it enhances your appreciation of things like buildings and cultures if you can recognize the many layers behind it all. So when I look at a cathedral facade now, and I can see immediately, okay, so they've got that little double window thing that's the style which is taken directly from Muslim Spain. Yes. The slender columns, the use of animals, especially fantastical animals in the carvings, you know, all of that has come in via the Islamic world, going right back, you know, even pre-Islamic, obviously, not just Islamic. A lot of it comes way earlier than Islam. As we said right at the beginning, everything didn't miraculously pop out with Islam. You know, Islam got things from Christian, Byzantine areas and from Iranian, Sasanian examples as well. And so, you know, everything builds on what went before and takes the best, by and large, and synthesizes it into something new. So when I look at a cathedral facade now, I can kind of decipher it. I can read it, if you like. So I can see, you know, the trio of pointed arches at the bottom, the use of pearl beaded framing, which is most definitely an Islamic thing, which has come into use in cathedrals. The use of pairs of animals back to back or facing each other, that's something that's come in from the Iranian art sort of subjects, if you like, that they seem to have invented this idea of paired animals, especially fantastical animals that don't exist, you know, just completely, you know, crazy dragons and then you get creatures playing musical instruments as well, suddenly appearing in Christian cathedrals, much to the puzzlement of clergy, the British clergy, who looked at it and think, what is that doing in my cathedral? Why is this crazy bear, half goat, half bear, playing a lute in my church? You know, and they tried to find religious explanations for these things, sometimes which were completely ridiculous and hilarious. I mentioned some of them in the book, you know, because they're actually quite funny, the things they dream up.
But where do these come from? Sorry, where did
well, where they come from, again, you can trace it right back. There's a whole tradition in Arab and Islamic art and culture of animals playing musical instruments. It's a fun thing. It's the sort of it's the caliph having fun in his court. You know, it's so even in the early Umayyad palaces, yes, there's a bear playing a lute. And there are women, too, depicted in secular settings. So in a palace, not in a mosque, but in a palace, you'll get women musicians in Umayyad times, in Islamic palaces. Yes. Because, you know, that's what their entertainment consisted of, women musicians, women dancers, bears trained to play instruments and do crazy things. And this tradition then finds its way in. But it's very funny when it then appears in a Christian setting, in a religious setting.
Yeah.
I think that's hilarious, actually, the way that hasn't been understood before. That it's just baffled the clergy, and they just don't get it. They don't understand why all their cloisters are suddenly full of these crazy beasts who have no connection with religion.
I mean, you've written a number of books now looking at this debt that European civilization, architecture in particular, pays to Islamic civilization, or owes to Islamic civilization. But has any of that been recognized today? I mean, you've written these books, you've obviously published it, and it's moved around. These books have moved around academic circles, but also broader cultural circles. Is there a movement to embrace this link to the Islamic world? I mean, at heritage sites, for example, can we see now on little plaques, the names of the unknown craftsman or craftsmen, or a nod to Islamic architecture?
It's starting to happen.
Oh, yeah?
Actually, yes. I mean, it is interesting because these things take time.
Right.
There is the beginning of an acknowledgement that I've observed now. So, for example, Durham Cathedral. If you go to the website of Durham Cathedral, there's quite a bit of acknowledgement of borrowings that have come in from Islamic Spain.
Wow.
That they specifically recognise, and it's frankly undeniable when you go to somewhere like Durham Cathedral. But they do recognise it. A few European sites I've seen acknowledgement too of Islamic influence, and so it's starting to happen.
Okay.
I've been told that at Bath University, for example, they changed the curriculum at university for the architecture course, that they wanted to make sure that there is this acknowledgement to Islamic architecture. So it's starting. And another very interesting one, actually, which is an exhibition that's going on at the moment here in London, William Morris and Art from the Islamic World, up at the William Morris Gallery in Walthamstow. And that's running now until March the 9th, I think it is. And that is specifically highlighting the fact that William Morris, who we think of as quintessentially English, got the inspiration for his patterns, his designs, from the Islamic world. And they've done that by showing and collecting in the exhibition all the objects which he himself or members of his family owned. And you can see it there, so he's got bits of metal ewers with designs. He's got Ottoman tiles, and you can see the patterns replicated from the possessions he had in his own home. He was most definitely inspired by these, and he copies is not quite a fair word, but he definitely takes huge inspiration from that and synthesizes it into something slightly new, but there's no mistaking where he got it from. None whatever. It's clear as day. Once you see it, it's undeniable. And this is what happens. What do I find with people is that once I've explained it to them and they've read the book, I often get people writing to me and friends telling me as well. It's amazing how now I see it with different eyes. Now I get it. Once you've explained it, it's kind of obvious. That was the best comment I had. That I did a sort of 2-part seminar thing, and the audience was just sort of saying, my goodness, I never understood before how to look at it, but now that you have step by step taken me through where all these things came from, it really is obvious. And that's it. Once you see it, it is actually hiding in plain sight. It's right there. in the buildings. The buildings speak for themselves. You can't. Architecture doesn't lie. It's there, a historical record. It's not a document, but it's a record that tells you exactly what happened and where all the influences came from.
I mean, beyond architecture, because in a way you could say, I don't know, if I went to Dubai today, Dubai is, it's got these massive skyscrapers, and in a way it's a nod to Western, I don't know, architecture, right? Or American architecture. They model themselves in New York or one of these mega cities that traditionally would belong to the West. Is there any evidence to say that beyond architecture, there was this cross-cultural input from the Islamic world to Europe?
Beyond architecture, well, yes. I mean, the other fields in Islamic Spain, for instance, and as I mentioned, the Arabs were there for 800 years, nearly, as a very long time, So the influences, apart from the architectural things, the other areas where Muslims dominated were carpentry and metalworking, the use agriculture and use of water wheels, so very, very much more advanced irrigation systems. So in Spain, for instance, there before the Arabs arrived, there was only one harvest a year. Once the Arabs brought in their new techniques, their new irrigation techniques, water management, there were 3 to 4 harvests a year. So, of course, the productivity was suddenly way, way up, and of course they brought in all the different types of food that we now take for granted, oranges and lemons and pomegranates and dates and apricots, so many things that we now just think of as normal. When you actually go back and this kind of thing has been studied and analysed by American academics like Thomas Glick and Brian Catlos. Those are the two who've really, really studied Islamic Spain in detail to look at the top areas that were dominated by Muslims because they were very, very skilled. So textiles was another one. Huge ability with silk and the manufacture of luxury end textiles. And of course the clergy then wore beautiful textiles made by Muslims. And sometimes they even had Kufic writing written on the hems because the bishops thought that this was the language of Christ. They thought it was holy writing. So they had it, on the hems of their beautiful gowns and things,
I mean, that's... I had a guest on, a remarkable guest actually a few weeks back, and Marian Khan, and she's a journalist, and she mentioned a throwaway comment about how Islam contributed to the intellectual ascendancy, I suppose, of the West and the Enlightenment, and we had a torrent of abuse on social media. It was relentless. How dare you say that? I mean, can you wade into that conversation by any chance? I mean, do you have any thoughts about that intellectual connection between the Islamic world and Europe?
Well, I mean, it's undeniable. It's completely undeniable. So again, going to Muslim Spain, and this is all documented. So at that time that I was telling you about, so 8th, 9th, 10th century, when Islamic Spain, the Caliphate of Cordoba, was at its peak in the 10th century. And at that time, the Caliph, had huge libraries with I think it was 400,000 books. And paper, by the way, was brought in from, the Arabs didn't invent it. It was invented in China, but it was then used in Baghdad, and the Arabs, via Muslim Spain, brought paper into Europe. So, Europe was behind in all of that. Yeah. But then at the time of the Reconquista, these the monasteries that I am telling you about, they thought themselves very learned if they had sort of 300 or 400 manuscripts. There was a real awareness that the real learning was the realm of the Arab Muslims at that time. And this was recognized to the extent that there's one actually very interesting example of somebody who went on to become the Pope.
Perfect.
And Sylvester II, I think his name was, but he was in a French monastery, and he wanted to study. He wanted to improve his learning. He was obviously a very clever young man, and he escaped from his monastery and went to Muslim Spain, and studied with a Saracen philosopher. And even then, there's one version where he went and studied under a Saracen philosopher in Kairouan as well, which was one of the top universities at that time. So there was a clear recognition that the place of learning was Islamic Spain and the Islamic world. You know, they held the key for all this knowledge, the scientific knowledge, the medical knowledge, the philosophical knowledge. There was so much that came in via the Islamic world, but especially the scientific mathematical side of things, and that this guy from the monastery that I've mentioned, you know, he then, having acquired all of that knowledge, he was actually then on very good terms with his teachers, his Saracen teachers, and he continued to acknowledge them, and was then, as the most learned man in Christendom at that time, became the Pope, briefly, only for about 2 or 3 years, I think. But, you know, and he openly acknowledged where he got his learning from, which is, you know, rare and rather wonderful. But again, he's one of the few documented cases. He's sometimes called the scientist Pope.
Dr. Diana Darke, I mean, it's really been fascinating. You're a distinguished academic and author, of course, and I hope it's not insulting if I say, do you do walking tours? It'd be wonderful to go with you to the cathedrals across the UK and beyond.
Well, I've never thought about it. I've never thought about it.
I say it's a throwaway comment.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I do it instinctively now.
Yes.
I mean, now I just love going around cathedrals, and you know, even each time you go, you see new things. You know, you don't get it all the first time.
Right.
You have to go and revisit, and each time, you know, different things suddenly pop out. The more you look, the more you see.
Yeah.
It really is like that, and it is a case of hiding in plain sight. As I say, you just need to train your eye, and then it's undeniable as well.
Brilliant. And
So I
see,
think,
yes.
I mean, I'm hoping that my new word, Islamesque,
Yes.
you know, is going to become a word, you know, a proper word that gets taken into the English language, and that people, and I've been pleased actually. I mean, the book got a starred review in Publishers Weekly, which is apparently only given to books of, what do they say, exceptional quality and distinction.
Yeah.
It had a review in The Guardian last week, very positive.
Yeah.
Middle East Eye, very almost over the top positive.
Yes.
But yeah, no, I'm inevitably there is some pushback. There always is because it is saying some quite, you know, it requires a complete rethinking of European art history. Basically, I'm sort of taking it on and saying, look, you have to completely rethink this.
Brilliant. And I'm just looking for flicking through
that's
your
right.
books. and
Yes,
you've got
yes. It's very well
photographs and
illustrated.
illustrations.
It's a very visual subject, and you have to see the buildings, and that's why I insisted that there was this gallery of images at the back where we label everything up so that all the elements that are being talked about throughout the book can be clearly seen.
Well, I hope my viewers do purchase your book, and I hope to see many of them walking around cathedrals, as so will I. With these photographs. Well, Dr. Diana Darke, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.